Hello, welcome to Cake That's YouTube channel. Today I want to talk about tips and tricks for good old-fashioned regular fermentation. I've done a video previously on tips and tricks for pressure fermentation, and there's a link below if you want to know more about that, but this is going to focus solely on fermentation that is not pressurized, which is probably how most brewers are still fermenting their beers. Now, I've been brewing for over 10 years now, and the vast majority of my fermentations for that 10 years has been regular fermentation, and I want to share some of this knowledge with you. There's going to be some caveats, so please do listen for the whole point, because there will probably be times when to use this tip or trick and times where maybe it's not that great. So stay tuned and let's get to it. Point 1. You can use boiling wort to sterilize your fermenter. So sterilization or sanitization is really, really important, and we've got things like ChemSan to help, but the best kind of sanitization is heat sterilization, and wort is already boiling, and that's going to sanitize anything it comes into contact with. So what I sometimes like to do is, as soon as the boil is finished, I turn off the kettle and I open up the tap and drain the wort, which is still boiling, into my fermenting vessel. Now, please be careful, because firstly, dealing with boiling wort is very dangerous. Probably shouldn't have to say that, but just to be clear, it's very dangerous, so be careful. Make sure you've got some good gloves. Make sure the equipment can handle boiling wort. So I'm using silicone hoses, which can handle boiling liquids, and I'm using a bucket, which can also handle boiling liquids. I would strongly recommend against using glass, against using pressure fermenters, against using any kind of fermenter where heat is going to be an issue, and do double check that it can take boiling wort before pouring boiling wort into it. However, the plus side to this is that you don't need to then use water to cool down the wort, and you can save on chemicals and ingredients that way, such as ChemSan. It means the brew day gets finished a bit quicker as well, which some people like to shave time off, and this is actually quite a good way of doing it. And it's also going to sterilize your fermenter way more effectively than any chemical can. So this bucket that I've had for years now, and I've never had any issues with it getting infected, because these plastic buckets, sometimes they can get small scratches in which can harbor bacteria, but by every so often just dumping the boiling wort into there, it's going to kill any bacteria in there. There are some caveats though. As mentioned, check that your equipment can handle it. Secondly, this isn't really recommended for styles which are hoppy. So if you're making IPAs and pale ales, it's best not to do this, because the rapid cool down that you get from using a heat exchange or a immersion chiller or something like that, what that does actually is it stops the essential oils of the hops evaporating away. If you were to try and do a hoppy beer this way, you'll find your beer will come out more bitter, and it will also have less hop character. So this is really good for multi styles or yeast forward styles, or basically any style which doesn't depend on hops for the flavour. Something else to take into account is when to pitch the yeast. Obviously, you need to let the wort cool down naturally by itself, and that means that you need to wait for it to be at pitching temperature. Now, when it gets to about 30 degrees or so, maybe you can put it in your fermentation chamber, or you can start to cool it down other ways to try and cool it down a bit more rapidly. But if you leave it too long, then because nothing is really sealed properly, wild bugs will take over and spoil it. So you just need to be really on it with pitching the yeast at the right time. Tip number 2 is the fermentation temperature control. So I've got a fermentation chamber, which you've all seen, and many brewers have this, but of course I've spoken to many brewers who don't have this, and they can't due to maybe cost or space constraints. But there are still really interesting ways that you can control the temperature of your fermentation. And this is a way that I still use today. It's to, once you're done with the brew, is to put it into a big flexi tub or trug or whatever these things are called, and then fill with water and put in an aquarium heater. Once you've done that, wrap the whole thing in a sleeping bag or a blanket or towels or something which is going to help insulate that heat. And that's going to hold it at temperature. The caveat to this is these aquarium heaters, they are good, but you might find the temperatures are going to be a little off, and it might take a bit of time to judge just how much by. So for example, mine, if I want the fermenting wort to be at 18 degrees or so, I need to set it to 20 degrees because there's usually a 2-degree difference between the temperature setting on the heater versus the temperature of the wort. So this is really good for heating. So what it does require is that it's sat in a room which is colder than you want it to ferment at. However, something to note as well is that if you want a beer to ferment at 20 degrees, which is room temperature doesn't really stay at 22 degrees. It kind of fluctuates, and at night is going to get quite a bit cooler. And those temperature fluctuations are also quite bad for fermenting beer. So even if your room is 20 degrees, having this setup can really help, because as the room cools down, this is going to stay at 20 degrees. Tip number 3 is to try and capture the CO2 that is given off during fermentation. You might be wondering why you want to do this. Well, as you cold crash your beers, the liquid inside the fermenter shrinks, and as it shrinks, it pulls in gas through the airlock. And what can happen is you can start to bring in oxygen. If you don't want to bring oxygen into your beer to stop it oxidizing, then something you can do is, during active fermentation, set up 2 jars which are connected to each other and the fermenter, and this stores the CO2. Now just make sure that the last one along in the chain has an airlock on, or there is a way for gas to escape. So what I would do is I would use Kilner jars, mostly because I had these lying around and the lids are very cheap to replace, and I would drill holes into the lids, and in the holes I would put grommets. What I have found is using some beer tubing, this actually fits into the grommets quite well. It's the same size, almost as if it's standardized or something. And I would connect these up in a series so that gas would be pushed out of one jar and then into the other and then out through the airlock. And then when I cold crash, it starts pulling the gas from the jar, which should just be CO2. Now, I use these jars because this is what I just happen to have a lot of lying around, but if I was going to do this again, I would actually recommend getting larger plastic jars, because if there is a problem, and let's say it couldn't vent properly, there isn't going to be the risk of exploding glass flying around the place. Also, even though those lids are cheap, if you use plastic is an awful lot easier to drill through than even those metal circles. However, even what I'm trying now, and this is still an early days development, is I'm using glass demijohns, which are 5 litres each. And this is a sort of design in progress, which is very similar setup to how I would use the jars, but it's just got more space for more gas. And I am drilling holes into the rubber bungs to allow for the inlet and outlet of the tubing. However, the ideal setup, which is what I'm trying to achieve, would be one length of beer line going right down to the bottom of the jar. And this is just because when it starts to suck in air, carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen, so carbon dioxide is going to be at the bottom of the demijohn. Cool, thank you so much for watching. If you've got any of your own tips, then please do write them below in the comments. Also, please let me know how you got on with these. Also, if this video has been useful, please do give a like, please subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.